Good evening. Apparently not. Come on, this is the evening the Lord has made. The Bible says you shall rejoice in it whether you like it or not. Right? So it doesn't matter how warm or cold it is, it's still a good evening, right? So let's try that one again. Good evening. I'll tell you what, 3 weeks ago I was in a minus 20 in Russia. I went home to Florida to warm up, and then I came here to cool off. And I think you guys are trying to bake me. I'm going to take this off. Telling you what. I actually like the cold. I just came back from my 48th mission trip to Russia. I've been going 2 and 3 times a year since 1994. So I've seen a lot of stuff going on in Russia, and I write about it in my newsletter. I am a full-time creation missionary. So I just want to kind of explain that to you. I head up Creation Worldview Ministries. Now, the name Creation, of course, what we're about, worldview, because we teach primarily a Christian biblical worldview through creation science. 95% of what we do is talking about creation science. We do a little bit other things. You'll find, for instance, I have a book on the feasts of the Old Testament available out there, and that's kind of a passion of mine. But 95% of what we're about is dealing with biblical scientific creationism. But we're a full-time missionary organization. We literally work on 5 continents in 20 languages around the world. If you'll go to our website at creationworldview.org, you'll find that it is in 3 languages. It's in English, Russian, and Portuguese, because we do mission work in Brazil every year, and then 2 or 3 times a year in Russia, and of course other countries as well with interpretation. So you can read them in any one of the 3 languages you want to, okay? Apparently you all want to read it in English. I get that opinion. Okay. So we do have materials in Spanish, but not much. But we do have some Spanish materials as well. But I go to Kazakhstan, I go to Armenia, Canada, all kinds of different foreign countries, but we are working in areas of 5 continents, and we're doing ministry in 20 languages around the world. Just to give you a little hint about what we're about. But basically, we're talking about a Christian biblical worldview, and I stress that because I think all of you will agree, you don't have to be a Christian to believe in creation. There are people who believe in creation who are not Christians. One is not equal to the other. Now, for instance, Jews, Muslims, and Christians are all called people of the book, meaning that all accept the first 11 chapters of Genesis, or at least theoretically, they accept the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Obviously, the Muslims go way off track, starting at chapter 12 of Genesis. The Jews don't accept the New Testament. But I can say, having been a biblical scientific creationist, I became a Christian at the age of 27. But I think you'll agree, and certainly in all of my studies today, I can say this. Today, even if I were not a Christian, I would still be a creationist, because it's good science. You know, I came first into this world as an evolutionary believing scientist. I believed in evolution, I taught it, I believed it, I earned my science degrees as an evolutionist. I taught it in public schools, universities. At 27, in a search for truth, I became a Christian. At the age of 28, I became a biblical scientific creationist. And at that point, I started teaching on this issue. So I've been teaching on it since I was 28 years old. And I founded Creation Worldview Ministries as a missionary outreach, primarily to take the message of creation in live presentations to small and medium-sized churches, because there are ministries who specialize in large churches. But I think that leaves out the small and medium-sized church for live presentations. And while you can certainly do much with DVDs. Now, we brought 1 copy of all of our DVDs available out there. I brought DVDs by a few others because DVDs are a good medium. I would think you would approve of all the ones out there. And I did bring my 2 books, one on the feasts and one on creation. And if you do not remember, you were not here the last time I was here, we do have a special on the books. If you buy the book, the autograph is free. Or you can buy the autograph and I'll give you the book. There's also a sliding scale on the DVDs that we produce. Ours are only $13 a piece. Some of them have 2 messages on them. Some of them are an hour and a half of material. But there's a sliding scale on that too. So that if you buy 5, 10, 15, or 20, there's a $1 discount at each level as well. And there's no sales tax tonight. So aren't you going to get a discount? Hello? Come on, you can talk with me. It's okay. I'm from out of town. Are we good? Now, actually, I did not pick the topic tonight. He did. He may not remember it, but but he did ask me, in looking at all of our stuff. We do 50 different presentations, and the one tonight on creation evangelism is certainly one that's very near and dear to me. I know that you would not be here if you were not interested in the subject, but I want to simply say, creation evangelism, who started it? The Apostle Paul started creation evangelism 2,000 years ago. And what did Paul say? He said, follow him as he follows Christ. Is that correct? And so we as creation scientists, we are simply following Paul, who was the first creation evangelist. And I think if Paul initiated creation evangelism, it's probably a pretty good way to reach people. How about you? Come on, folks. I know you need to warm up a little here and so forth. But if it's the way Paul did it, I think it's a pretty good method, don't you? And so what I want to do is I want to talk with you about creation evangelism tonight. Now, please understand me. You know, sharing your faith in Christ with others is a perfectly valid way of winning others to Christ. Agreed? But it doesn't work with everybody. The world is asking good questions. The world outside these walls is asking good questions. If you don't have good answers to good questions, they've got no reason to pay any attention to you at all. And so sharing your faith, a perfectly valid way of winning others to Christ, doesn't always work. And when you're trying to share your faith in Christ with someone and they say, wait a minute, what about the dinosaurs? What about those millions and billions of years they talk about in school? What about that supposed proof for human evolution? What about that stuff? And if you don't know good answers to good questions, 2 things will happen. Number 1, you will shrink back. You will say, maybe I'm not called to evangelism, and you might even stop trying. But think about the other person. They're going to think they were right. They weren't, but they're going to think they were. And they're going to become more hardened in their position, perhaps impossible to reach the next time. So what I'm talking about is an alternative approach. Sharing your faith, great, but if it doesn't work, you need an alternative approach, correct? And this is one where we deal with the answers to tough questions. Now, for instance, I mentioned the DVDs I brought and so forth. We've revised some of those, and we have new ones available that I did not have the last time I was here. We have put a new one together, for instance, showing that no old Earth view is acceptable theologically. We as creation scientists do this generally with geochronometers, with age of the Earth issues, with science. But I'm looking at it, in this case, in a theological way, showing it's simply not acceptable, and why. Many people say, well, the age of the Earth issue isn't important to the gospel. Well, it isn't the salvation issue, and we will never make it that, but it nonetheless is essential to the gospel, and we show why. But other things that we have done, for instance, I recently updated our information on the Ark of Noah, including a section on why it will never be found and isn't there to be found. People have very linear thinking when it comes to the Ark of Noah, and they think that the Ark of Noah only had one purpose, and that was to survive the flood, which of course it did. But it had 2 purposes. Think with me. When they came out of the ark, they stepped out into a world that had been absolutely cataclysmically destroyed. They need firewood, housing, stockades. Where are they going to get the wood? They're going to disassemble the ark. And there will not be a live tree on earth for 15 to 30 years that can be used for timber. And therefore, they're going to wait at the ark for 15 to 30 years before they leave. Now, I can't prove this biblically, but I think the trigger to leave and migrate, as they did westward, was when they ran out of materials. I can't prove it, but it's a very logical thought. But I go through the step-by-step process of how to look at this, that the ark really had 2 purposes and not one. So, there are things that might be of interest to you. Tonight, however, in conjunction with Ed, we've decided to talk about creation evangelism. Now, this is a message that's very near and dear to my heart. First of all, because Paul wrote my biography 2,000 years ago. Hello? The Apostle Paul wrote my biography 2,000 years ago. This message is very near and dear to me. So what I'm going to ask you to do is this. If you will open your Bibles, iPhones, Androids, iPads, whatever you happen to have your Bible in, and please turn to Paul's letter to the Evolutionists with me. You're not turning. Paul's letter to the Evolutionist. Oh, well, think with me, folks. First of all, remember that we call the books of the Bible books, but in fact, many of them are also referred to as letters. Is that correct? And often we have sermons contained inside of these letters. We have sermons that Jesus preached. We have sermons that the apostles preached. Correct? Yeah. But sometimes there's a letter inside a letter. And Paul's letter to the Evolutionists is contained inside his letter to the Romans. If you'll turn to chapter 1 of Romans, and I want to start at verse 16. Paul starts his letter to the Evolutionists at verse 16. And Paul starts with two very, very positive statements, if you will take a note. He says, and by the way, tonight, I hope I don't offend anybody, I'm using the New American Standard, but if you would prefer, I can use any translation you'd like. Is that acceptable? Thank you. Notice that Paul starts with two very positive statements at his beginning of his letter. In verse 16, he says this. It's as if he's facing in one direction. And he says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." Question, are you? Okay, I'll repeat. This is a participation event. You get to respond. When I ask a question, you really can give an answer. Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. My question is, are you? No, I'm glad to hear it. He says, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Now, first of all, let's talk about what this word Greek, or Gentile as it's often translated, really means. Remember that the Greeks were evolutionists. The Greco-Roman world of Alexander the Great and the Romans was a world that believed in evolution. They believed that people evolved, and they believed that gods evolved. And so when it says Gentile, although the word Gentile means anybody who's not Jewish, here, talking about Greeks, it's talking about evolutionists. And it says that the gospel is the power of salvation to the Jew first and also to everybody else. Does that leave anybody out? Excuse me? There are only two kinds of people in God's economy, Jews and those that aren't Jews. Hello? And I want to remind you of a verse. How many of you remember in 1 Corinthians 1:23, it says this, the preaching of Jesus Christ is a stumbling block to a Jew, but it is foolishness to a Greek or a Gentile or an evolutionist. Now, why is the preaching of Jesus Christ a stumbling block to a Jew, but foolishness to an evolutionist? Well, here's my question for you. How do you introduce somebody to the Son of God if they don't think there's a God? How do you introduce somebody to the Son of God if they don't think there's a Father? Hello? And that's why creation evangelism is so critically important. So why is the preaching of Jesus Christ a stumbling block to a Jew? Because a believing Jew knows the right Father, Creator God. They know the right Father, Creator God from the Old Testament, correct? The problem from the Jew is for them to accept Jesus as the promised Messiah. Now, there are many reasons that they should, but the problem is to get them to do it, correct? So that's a stumbling block. But to an evolutionist, the preaching of Jesus Christ is absolute foolishness, because how can there be a son if there's no father? Paul then goes on to say this in verse 17, for in it, referring to the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, and then quoting from the Old Testament, but the righteous man, and I would add, or woman, shall live by faith. Is that correct? And Paul makes these two very positive statements as if he's facing this way. But at the end of verse 17, Paul turns 180 degrees. And until the end of the chapter, it's as if he's facing exactly in the opposite direction. And from verse 18 to the end of the chapter, Paul uses some of the most graphic language in the entire Bible. It's one of the things I absolutely love about the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul never pulled a punch. Hello? Now, in addressing an audience of this age, hello? All of us here except one. How many of you remember a comic strip character called Joe Palooka? Hello? Can I get some hands? Thank you. Where did Joe Palooka get his name? I mean, he was a good guy, but where did Joe Palooka get his name? It comes from the Greek word pugilist, meaning prize fighter, because remember, he was a prize fighter. He was Joe Palooka, he was Joe the prize fighter. And Paul writes and he says, we are not like pugilists who shadow box against a wall. The Apostle Paul, if he ever started to take a swing, he always intended to go all the way. He never went halfway and then pulled back. It's one of the things I love about the guy. You know, after Jesus, he's the next guy I want to meet. I'm serious. And so, starting at verse 18, Paul says, but, notice, positive, and then he goes, but the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men and women who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I spent 20 years of my life being taught by men and women who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Think with me for a minute. Now, I am unique among creation scientists, but every one of us is unique, right? But I grew up on the campus at the University of California, Berkeley. I was born in Chinatown in San Francisco, California. But by the time I started school, we had moved across the bay to Berkeley, and I actually went to elementary and junior high school in Berkeley, California. Now, this is like going to school in Albania. Apparently, you all have never been to Albania. Berkeley is the capital of evolution. It is the capital of liberalism. And I grew up there at Berkeley, and I was being taught evolution in the public schools in the 50s when I was in elementary school. But when I was not in the elementary school system in Berkeley, I used to spend my time in the paleontology laboratories at Berkeley, learning about dinosaurs, fossils, and evolutionary theory from PhDs when I was only in elementary school. I knew about these things so well that by the time I hit the 3rd grade, they were already barring me from one classroom to the other in the California public school system, and I was teaching the other children about dinosaurs, fossils, and evolutionary theory because I knew more about it than the teachers did. Absolutely true story, folks. I would also, when I left California after completing my 9th grade of education in the public school system, moved to Washington, D.C., and I actually went to high school in the District of Columbia. Again, this is like going to high school in Albania. And apparently, again, you do not understand the description here. They're both foreign countries, and they're both equally dangerous. Hello? Can I get an amen here from somebody? But I was a trained evolutionist. I believed it, and I taught it from the 7th grade to the university level. And Paul talks about there are those men and women who will suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And I spent 20 years of my education being taught by men and women who suppressed the truth in unrighteousness. Now, I do want to say this. Some of them did it innocently. Some of them just did it parroting what they were taught, and I did the same thing. Some of them did it just going along with the crowd, right? But there were some who knew it was not true and taught it to me anyway. I mean, some just did it to get a paycheck, but some knew it wasn't true and taught it to me anyway. Is that correct? And they were suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. And I think you'll agree, this is a bold statement, right? It's a bold statement to say there are men, women who will suppress the truth in unrighteousness. But notice how Paul then goes on, because the sentence continues, and he says, you know this is true because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. What Paul says is, every human being on earth knows that there's a God. Even the atheist, even Dawkins knows that God exists in spite of his stand. But why? How can we say that? It's very simple. Because everybody knows there's something greater than themselves. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I do missionary work on 5 continents. If you can get me an invitation to Antarctica, I'll go. Hello? I'm serious as a heart attack. Come on, folks, that's serious. But I work on 5 continents. It doesn't matter where you go. You can go to the darkest place you can find in the middle of a continent. You can go to an island in the Pacific. Everybody worships something. It may be a rock, a tree, clothing, a car, money, power, title, another human being. But everybody worships something because everybody knows there's something greater than themselves. And even the atheist knows that God exists. They're just not willing to admit it, right? But I think you'll agree that to say that everybody knows that there is a God, even the atheist, is a bold statement, correct? And the Apostle Paul backs up that bold statement by saying the next verse. Notice he then says this, how do you know this? Verse 20, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without. I left off that last word for a good reason. Many translations do use the word excuse, but there are other English translations as well. But I left that word off intentionally. I did. First of all, Paul says everybody knows God exists. Why? And by the way, for anybody who thinks that the old earth is acceptable, what did Paul just say? For since the creation, it has been seen. Jesus said Adam and Eve were there at the beginning. He did not say they came along millions of years later. Is that correct? And one of the arguments against an old earth from a theological standpoint is God has always had a witness, starting with Adam and Eve, that from the creation people have been here. They didn't come along later. And an old earth is not acceptable theologically. Notice, however, what is he doing in verse 20? 400 years after this was written, St. Augustine of Hippo said that there were 5 classical arguments for the existence of God. One of them was the argument by design. But 400 years before St. Augustine of Hippo wrote that, Paul uses the exact same argument by design in Romans 1. He says everybody knows God exists because of the evidence, the design that he's left behind. That everybody knows that when you see design, there's a designer. Now, think with me for a minute. I have been in this building only once before. Many of you were here the last time I was here too, so you can bear witness to this, okay? I have been in the building before. However, there are things up here that I have never, ever touched. And I'm going to say there's a dark brown box over there in that corner. I happen to know what it is, but I'm just going to call it a dark brown box. We're going to agree that it does exist, correct? But I have never felt it, smelt it, weighed it. I have never sensed it in any way whatsoever, except that we will agree it exists over there, correct? Now, if you don't know what it is, it's a speaker for the organ. But nonetheless, think with me for a second. I've never heard it. I've never heard anybody play it. I've never gone and looked inside to see whether there's anything actually in that box, correct? But whether it's a real organ speaker or it's a fake organ speaker, what is the one thing I absolutely know about it? Well, actually, I could be colorblind. And actually, I do have a slight color blindness, that's true. So maybe it is brown and maybe it's not. Again, because I could be colorblind, we agree it existed, correct? But I've never, tested it, again, smelled it, tasted it, weighed it. But what is the one thing I absolutely do know about it? We agree it exists, but what's the one thing I absolutely know about it? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I know somebody made it. Is that correct? Because things like that don't come into existence by random chance. Is that correct? Or, let's see. Well, I've never been on the platform, so I can just pick any of those chairs up there. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen these chairs before, etc., but I have never sat in one. Therefore, I will call it a chair because that's what we generally call things that look like that as a chair, correct? But again, I've never smelled it, weighed it, tasted it. I've never sat in it. I don't know whether it's made out of balsa wood. If I sat in it, it might not hold me up. I might fall to the floor, correct? But regardless, I do know one thing absolutely about it. There was a chair maker, correct? But think with me, based on the age of that chair or that speaker over there, I mean, that one's been around a long time, folks, let me tell you. I remember when those first came out. The organ speaker maker or the chair maker might be alive today or they might not be, correct? But I have never met them. They are invisible to me, is that correct? I've never seen them. And if they have passed away, I may never see them. I mean, if they're a Christian, I might meet them in heaven, but there's a possibility maybe they weren't and I might not, correct? But I do know they exist or existed because of the evidence they left behind, correct? Now, many of you are certainly aware, and I realize I'm somewhat preaching to the choir here, but when you think about it, there is more complexity in one tree outside this building than there is in the entire area of the city. Is that correct? Taking all the electrical, plumbing, structural things, all the other stuff into consideration, there's more information, more complexity, more design in one tree out there than there is in this entire area. Now, if you can see a tree and you see the complexity of that, why can't you see that there's a tree maker? And then we go to people. Why can't you look at people and see that there's a people maker, correct? I mean, it's the same argument by design. You know, many of you, the complexity of the DNA molecule. Many of you know about genetic entropy, an excellent argument for a young Earth, and disproves evolution completely, correct? Yep. So when we see those sorts of things, we realize that the information content of the past was much greater than today. Things are breaking down, they're breaking down fast. I don't know how many of you are aware, but we are losing 1 to 2% of our genetic information per generation. I love my grandchildren, but they have 2 to 4% less genetic information in their bodies than I have in mine. Your great-grandparents were smarter individually, more intelligent, and had faster reaction times than we do today because of the loss of information by mutations over generations, correct? So when you backtrack that, you realize that we started with tremendous perfection and tremendous information that has simply been corrupted over time. Is that right? And so this argument by design is an excellent argument for the existence of God. Agreed? Now, some of you got a little bit ahead of me. You notice here, so that they are without. Now, many of you have the translation, as I do, the word is excuse. Another common English translation is the word reason, that they are without a reason, correct? But some of you, I know, can, and many of you could, if you wanted to, look at the Greek. You don't have to know Greek to read this word in Greek. You will recognize the characters. Now, please remember that Paul wrote this. I didn't say this. Hello? Are you listening? Just remember, Paul wrote this. I'm only saying what Paul wrote, right? But if you will look this up in the Greek, Paul actually wrote this. First of all, the word is apologia. It's apologia. Now, does that mean that I go around the world saying, forgive me, I'm so sorry, I'm a Christian, I couldn't help myself. Is that what a Christian apologist is?
Negative.
Thank you. Don't confuse the word with making an apology for a mistake. What does the word actually mean? In Greek, it should be translated the word defense. The real word means defense. And what is an apologist? An apologist is a person who gives a defense for what they believe. And the word means that the defense of your position is so rational, reasonable, so logical, so based in evidence that it becomes an overwhelming offense. Did you hear that? And so Paul says that they are without a defense. In essence, Paul says evolutionists are defenseless for believing what they believe. Hello? And so a Christian apologist is actually one whose argument for the Christian faith is so rational, reasonable, logical, and so based in evidence, it becomes an overwhelming offense, and that evolutionists don't have one, correct? But Paul goes on to say some very interesting things. He says in verse 21, "For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened." Now, verse 22 is on my top 10 list of my favorite verses of the Old Testament. I love this verse. Hello? I really do. Now, you'll have the English translation again. "Professing to be wise, they became," and I'm sure most of you have the word fools. Is that correct? Now, I think, first of all, you will have to admit that the word fool today is a relatively light word, typically as we use it today, right? So, for instance, I have been in Denver off and on over the years since 1966. So, I am familiar with the area, and I've been here in Colorado Springs and so on. But I'm certainly not a native, correct? So let's say I do drive into town, and I come up to a stop sign. And I come to a complete and total cessation of forward motion. This is the legal definition for stop. Hello? Look it up. That's the legal definition of stop, a complete and total cessation of forward motion. And then, after, of course, checking to make sure it's safe, I pull across the intersection and continue, but then I realize, wait a minute, I was supposed to turn right at that intersection, correct? Now, this is what they put steering wheels on cars, correct? To correct little errors, right? So I make a U-turn, I go back, and I correct my foolish little mistake, correct? But that's not the word. Again, you can read this in Greek without knowing Greek. Again, remember, Paul wrote this, I didn't. He said, professing to be wise. I mean, evolutionists stand up, on radio, on TV, Bill Nye the bow tie guy. And, right? And they pontificate, trust us, we know what we're talking about, right? Profess great wisdom in classrooms. But Paul says this, professing to be wise, they became mentally useless. That is the word in Greek. They became mentally useless. But he continues, because that's only the first part of the sentence. He says, professing great wisdom, they became mentally useless and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God from an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. They're evolutionists. They stop short. They worship the creature rather than the creator, correct? And Paul continues to elaborate on this because he says, starting in verse 24, therefore, because they are tree huggers, rock worshipers, whatever, he says, they have exchanged the glory of God, the creator, for the creation, correct? He says, therefore, God gave them over in the lust of their hearts to impurity, that their bodies might be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worship and serve the creature rather than the creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Correct? Now, I want you to think about this. For a moment, I want you to think about this not in a spiritual sense, but in an economic illustration, okay? Now, I know, I've been to Manitou Springs and I've been other places here, and certainly you are aware that around here you can go to places where they have the storefronts they used to have 100 years ago, correct? Stores 100, 120 years old, and I love going to those places, but you go, and the front is all glass on the front, right? And there's this big old door, and you walk in, and there's counters on three sides, there's shelves on three sides, and down at the end, there's this big old brass cash register, right? Come on, weighs a half a ton, right? Now, think about this from an economic standpoint. Paul says evolutionists have exchanged the truth of God for a lie. Now, I particularly like the bearded gentleman here, very distinguished with the hat on there. Looks like you should be in one of those stores, as a matter of fact, right? Come on, got to get it right now. Oh, well, try. So let's think. I walk into his store, and I have the truth. And I go into his store, and I walk to that back counter. I sit on the counter, and I said, sir, I'd like to buy one of those lies on the shelf over here. And he says, well, that's what I'm in business to do. So he takes the truth, gives me a lie, and I walk out of the store with a lie. Now please tell me, did I make a good deal or a bad deal? That was a bad deal. But what if I go into his store with a lie? I walk in, put it on the counter, and said, "Sir, I'd like to buy one of those truths over there on that shelf." And you say, "Well, that's what I'm in business for, right?" So you take my lie and you give me the truth, and I walk out of the store with the truth, right? So have I made a good deal or a bad deal? I made a good deal, correct? And Paul is saying evolutionists made a bad deal. They exchanged the truth for a lie. That's always a bad deal, correct? Now, I'm not going to read, starting in verse 26 to the end of the chapter. Relax. Well, not too much, no, sir. Let me give you a little bit of medical advice. You know, I have lectured in 4 medical universities in Russia. You don't want to sit there with your arms crossed, because if you do, it cuts off the oxygen to your brain, and you'll go to sleep. But I do want to say this. Starting at verse 26, Paul gives us the consequences of what happens when you teach evolution only. Think with me. Now, I am not going to read all of them. You can read them for yourself later. But I want to mention 4 specifically, and I'm going to list them in the order in which Paul wrote them, okay? So what are the consequences of teaching evolution only in our schools? The first is women become lesbians. Second, men become homosexuals. As you continue to read through the list, you will reach murderer. This includes abortion, euthanasia, homicide, and suicide. Remember that the word suicide simply means murder of self. And so they become murderers. Abortion, euthanasia, homicide, school violence. May I remind us all of Columbine, correct? How many of you remember what the 2 wrote before they did what they did at Columbine High School? The reason we were doing it was because we were taught evolution at the high school. That there was a superior and an inferior, and that they were superior and therefore had a right to blow away the inferior. Is that right? I'm not trying to bring up bad memories, but it's local history, folks. Correct? And this is the consequence of teaching evolution in school. Think with me. Evolution is a religion, first of all and foremost. Evolution is simply a religion. It's not science. It's not believed in scientifically. It's believed in philosophically. But not only is it a religion, but it's a religion of death. It only takes 4 generations for the teaching of evolution to destroy a nation. Now, I'm not a prophet, and I'm not the son of a prophet, but I'm telling you right now, we've been doing it for 3.5 generations. We have got to turn this around soon, real soon. But as you continue through the list, you will come down and you will find disobedient to parents. Now, I'm going to ask you a straight-up question. As in public schools, not only in Colorado, but of course in California where I grew up, or in Florida where I live today, or wherever, tell me something. As we continue to teach evolution in our public schools, regardless of where it is, do you see more lesbians, more homosexuals, more murder of all sorts, including school violence, and more disobedient to parents? It is a natural consequence of the teaching of evolution in school. Is that correct? But I want you to look at the very end of the chapter with me. Please take a look. Verse 32. And although they knew the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but they also give hearty approval to those who practice them. Now, I'm afraid to even ask the question here, so let me phrase it this way. I hope that you have never seen a gay rights parade, personally, but I'm sure every one of you has seen a gay rights parade video of some sort on the news or whatever, correct? But let me ask you to, just for a moment, remember watching a gay rights parade. There are people, at least they were, hello, who are parading down the street doing some of the most debauched things a human being could possibly do. Is that correct? But think with me, when you saw those videos, did you happen to notice the people standing on the curb applauding as the parade went by? Oh, yes. Oh, this is so right. Oh, yes, we must do this. Oh, yes. Is that correct? In verse 32, Paul is describing a gay rights parade 2,000 years ago in Rome. There are those who are in the parade, And there are those who stand on the curb applauding as the parade goes by. Hello? Now, ladies and gentlemen, that is the problem. Romans 1:16 to the end of the chapter, that is the problem. But what is the solution to the problem? Please turn with me to Acts 17. Now, I know that, again, many of you would be familiar with Acts 17. But I just wonder if we might find something a little new and additional tonight. Interestingly enough, we're going to start at verse 16. So this makes it really easy to remember the teaching. It's Romans 1:16 to the end of the chapter, and then Acts 17, verse 16, to the end of the chapter. Notice that in Acts 17, verse 16, now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him as he was beholding a city full of idols. Now, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, what is Athens? 2,000 years ago, Athens was the Berkeley of today. 2,000 years ago, Athens was the crossroads of the ancient world. Every caravan that went from Europe to Asia, Asia to Europe, went through Athens. Every ship who left ports in Egypt would go through Athens. And all the stuff from Europe going to Africa went through Athens. It was the crossroads of the ancient world, and it was the capital of evolution. It was the capital of liberalism. And notice that Paul has gone there first. You know, the Holy Spirit has called him to come from what they would have called Asia Minor, or Asia, to Europe. And he'll become the great apostle to the Gentiles, of course. But he comes to Athens and he's by himself initially, and he's waiting for his companions to join him, correct? And he's looking at Athens. Now, Athens, again, is this crossroads of the ancient world. It is the capital of liberalism, the capital of evolution. Again, they believed people evolved, gods evolved, everything evolved. And they asked the question that Pontius Pilate asked Jesus: what is truth? That question was not special. It wasn't special when Pilate said, what is truth? It was the question that every human being in that world asked at that time, every single day. And so Paul is looking at the city, and he says he's looking at a city full of idols. Now, it is absolutely true that Athens had many, many statues to many different things. They had statues to people, they had statues to gods, they had statues to things. It is absolutely true. Athens was full of these statues. But let me define the word idol for you for just a moment. The word idol means anything that stands between you and God. Hello? Again, it doesn't matter whether it's the worship of a rock, a tree, money, title, power, clothing, car, person. It doesn't matter. An idol is anything that stands between you and knowing the one true God, correct? So it says that Paul was looking at a city full of idols. He wasn't just looking at the statues. He was looking at everything that kept the Greeks, the Gentiles, the evolutionists from knowing the one true God. Notice then, it says this, verse 18. Verse 17. So while he was reasoning in the synagogue and with the Jews, the God-fearing Gentiles, and in the market every day with those who happened to be present. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know about you. I think I've got a busy life. You know, I'm doing a great deal of traveling, great deal of teaching and so forth. I try to have a family life. My wife and I will be married 48 years next March. But I think I lead a busy life. But compare your life, if you think you're busy, with that of the Apostle Paul. Because what is Paul doing? Well, he's in Athens, and on Friday night and Saturday, on Shabbat, he's in the synagogue with the Jews, reasoning with them about Jesus being the Messiah. But on Saturday night and Sunday, he's in the synagogue with the God-fearing Gentiles and the Christian Jews, because the synagogues were available for rent on Sunday, and the early Christians met in the synagogues. Of course, they had Jewish family members who were, friends of theirs, etc. And we didn't leave the synagogue until the Jews kicked us out. And if you don't believe me, I tell you what happened in my book on the feasts. But they literally kicked us out, which is why we don't worship on Shabbat anymore. But he's on Friday night and Saturday talking to the Jews about Jesus being the fulfillment of the scriptures about the coming Messiah. On Saturday night and Sunday, he's building up the God-fearing Gentiles and the Christian Jews in the faith, teaching them the things of Christianity, correct? What's he doing the other 5 days of the week? The other 5 days of the week, he's in the marketplace talking about Jesus with anybody and everybody he can find. He walks up to somebody and says, "Hey, friend, have you heard about this guy God raised from the dead?" "You haven't?" And he hooks an arm around him and says, "Come on, let's go down to McDonald's and I'll buy you a cup of coffee." McDonald's coffee is a great way to do evangelism, folks. And if you don't like coffee, just get soft drink. I don't care, but it's a great place to do evangelism. He just hooks an arm around him and says, "Come on, friend, let's go down here and let me just buy you a cup of something," right? I don't know about you, but he's working 7 days a week. I think he's a little busy. How about you? Yep. But notice what it says, verse 18. "And some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers were conversing with him, and some were saying, 'What would this idle babbler wish to say?' Others, 'He seems to be a proclaimer of strange deities.' Why?" Well, the Bible tells us why, doesn't it? It says because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection, correct? Now, first of all, in your Bibles, you will notice that in Acts 17, there are only two philosophies mentioned, the Epicureans and the Stoics. Now, why are they the only two mentioned in the Bible? Well, God is a perfect author. Hello? The reason that these two are mentioned in the Bible and none of the others, because there were 1,000 others, is first of all, it would take too long to list them, but they were all there. But the reason that the Epicureans and the Stoics are mentioned is because they represent the two ends of the spectrum of Greek philosophy. Who were the Epicureans? Now, Epicurus, the philosopher, had been dead for 300 years when Paul walked into Athens. He's talking to the disciples of this Greek philosopher, but Epicurus had been dead for 300 years. But Epicurus was the philosopher who said, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you may die." Epicurus wrote, "He who dies with the most toys still dies." Epicurus said, "You got to grab it while you can, because you only go around once in life, and when you die you cease to exist. You got to grab it while you can." But Epicurus was the philosopher who said every sensual pleasure was good, and every sensual pleasure should be taken advantage of as often as possible. And he promoted intimacy with men, women, and animals. Anything and everything as often as possible. And why do they call people who are gastronomes Epicurean? Because the Epicureans, remember, believed that every sensual pleasure was good and should be taken advantage of as often as possible. And so they are the ones who would eat a feast, go out in the alley, stick their finger down their throat, throw up, and go back in so they could eat more. That's why it's associated with eating. But they were the loosest, goosiest people in the ancient world. The Epicureans, everything and anything goes. And they were just the loosest, goosiest people in the entire world. They represented one end of the spectrum of Greek philosophy. There was 1,000 in between, Mithra and all the others. But on the other end of the spectrum were the Stoics. The Stoics taught no sensual pleasure of any value whatsoever. You were not even supposed to enjoy the process of getting children. Hello? Okay. When a baby was born in a Stoic family, they actually tattooed a frown on its face. No, that's an exaggeration, of course. The Stoics wouldn't laugh at the funniest joke they have ever heard in their life. And I am beginning to believe that some of you are Stoics. But the only reason the two are here is because they simply represent the two ends of the spectrum of Greek philosophy. But there were 1,000 in between. Every one of them claimed to be right. And everybody in the ancient world would ask the question, what is truth? You say it's true, you say this is true, you say, well, what's truth? And so the pilot's question was absolutely one of the most common questions in the world at the time. Notice also it says that he was preaching Jesus Christ and the resurrection. Now think with me, what's going on here? Paul comes into Athens, the capital of evolution, the capital of liberalism, the capital of all these different philosophies. And what does he do? He takes the 44 magnum of Christianity, points it right straight at those evolutionists and goes, boom! And some of the evolutionists did exactly what some of you just did. They just went, huh? What's that? Now, you have to understand something about the Greeks. The Greeks were the greatest gossips the world has ever known. I have this on biblical authority. I'm not giving you my opinion, okay? The Greeks were the greatest gossips the world has ever known, and I can prove it biblically. But think with me. In Athens, they had seen everything. Hello? When you came into town, the Greeks didn't care what you had. They didn't care whether you had gold, silk, spices. They didn't care if you had whatever, okay? They didn't care where it came from. They had seen it all. Hello? What was the first question a Greek asked when you came into town? What have you heard? What's the latest gossip from Jerusalem? What's the latest gossip in Rome, you know? How about down in Egypt? Are Anthony and Cleopatra still fooling around? Hello? Come on, folks. They didn't care what you had. They didn't care what you brought. The first question a Greek asked was, what have you heard? What's the latest gossip? Now, if you got that simple street gossip, you know the kind that sometimes you hear in church. Hello? Come on, folks. I'm nothing if I'm not real. You know, did you see what Mrs. So-and-so wore to church this morning? You got that kind of gossip. You handle that in the market, right? But if you've got that really big, juicy stuff, you know, the really good stuff, right? We got this official place up here on this hill over here called Mars Hill. You see that temple up there? That's where we talk about the really good stuff. Hello? And if you don't believe me that the Greeks weren't the biggest gossips the world has ever seen, please turn your page, so to speak. Look at verse 19. And they took him and brought him up to Mars Hill, saying, may we know what this new teaching is which you are proclaiming, for you are bringing some strange things to our ears. We want to know, therefore, what these things mean. And notice verse 21. If you have a good printer, verse 21 is in parentheses. There are very few parenthetic statements in the entire Bible. This happens to be one of them. There's another one in John chapter 9. There are very few verses of the Bible that are in parentheses, but this is one that is in parentheses. Notice verse 21. Now all the Athenians and the strangers visiting there used to spend their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something new. The Greeks were the greatest gossips the world has ever known, and I have biblical authority to prove it. Hello? And they take him up on Mars Hill. Now, Paul knows the Greeks. Paul writes excellent Greek. He knows their literature. In this chapter, he will quote one of their own poets. Hello? So he knows them, and he knows their literature, and he writes excellent Greek himself. And notice what happens. Verse 22. Paul stood in the midst of them and said, quote, men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. Come on, folks, you got to get the smile, okay? Oh, men of Athens, I've noticed you're very religious in all respects. I mean, doesn't that sound polite? I've noticed you're very religious in all respects. I mean, come on. When you read that in a two-dimensional word, it really sounds pleasant, nice, complimentary, doesn't it? But what you don't realize is, if you put it in 3 dimensions, Paul just took a 32-inch sword, stuck it between the ribs of the Greeks, turned it over, and then pulled it back out again. Seriously. Because, think with me, the word religion at its root means bondage. The root for religion is bondage. When I became a Christian, now you got to understand, I used to teach evolution, I used to be an evolutionist, correct? When people heard that I had become not only a Christian, but that I had become a young earth, biblical inerrant creationist, they said to me, oh, I hear you got religion. And I responded by saying, no, I ain't got religion. I have relationship. Hello? I don't have religion. I got relationship. The word religion is properly used when you use it this way. Oh, you know Uncle Fred. He plays football every Saturday morning religiously. You know Uncle Ed. Oh, sorry, I'll pick some. Uncle George. He plays golf every Saturday morning religiously. And please tell me, if he can't, say, go fishing, and he can't go golfing, or he can't play football, what happens for the next 6 days? They kick the cat, kick the dog, kick the wife. They aren't fit to live with for 6 days. Is that correct? Until the next Saturday morning rolls around, and he can go fishing, he can go play football, he can go, and then God is in his heaven, Jesus is at the right hand of the Father, and all is well with the world, correct? Now, what happened? They're in bondage to those things, is that correct? And if they can't do them, they're not fit to live with for 6 days, is that right? And so what Paul said to them was this: "Oh, men of Athens, I've noticed you're bound up to everything. You're in bondage to everything." Now, I'm not here to give a sermon on the unknown God. Most of you have had at least 10 of them in your lifetime, I'm sure. But what does Paul do? Again, Paul knows these people. He knows that Eastern religion is based on what can I do to placate the gods. Because in Eastern religion, which is everything except Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, all other religions of the world start in a belief in evolution. They are the only 3 religions that start with the concept of creation. All other religions start in evolution. And I would add, Hinduism is the most perfect example of evolution applied to religion. I mean, think with me. In Hinduism, you start off as a roach. But if you're a really good roach, then when you die, you get to come back as a mouse. But if you're a really good mouse, then you get to come back as a rat. But if you're a really good rat, then you get to come back as the cat. And if you're a really good cat, then you get to come back as a dog. And eventually you work up to a cow. And if you're really good at being a cow, you get to come back as a really bad person. But if you're really good at being a bad person, you get to come back as a mediocre person. And if you're really good at that, you get to work on up to what's called a Brahmin. And theoretically, you evolve your way to heaven. But what is the problem? Nobody ever makes it. Nobody ever makes it. But what's the worst consequence that it can possibly be? You just have to go back and start as a roach. Hello? But Paul talks to these Greeks. He's there with those statues and all those names, and he knows that Eastern religion is based on what can I do to keep the gods off my back? Because in Eastern religion, the gods are simply superhuman. They're just like us. They are equally sinful. They are equally capricious. They're just bigger than us. And so the whole concept of Eastern religion is, what can I do to keep the gods off my back? What offering, what amount of money can I pay them? Because if I don't do it, they're going to come down and hurt me. Hello? So Eastern religion is just, what can I do to keep the gods off my back? And, of course, because of that, what did the Greeks do? What did the evolutionists do? They had pedestals with no statues. They had a sign to an unknown God. Because what happened? As soon as they found out about this unknown God, they would immediately make a statue, put it on the pedestal, put a nice brass plaque there with their name, and say, "Oh, hey, don't hurt us. We only just found out you existed, but boy, just as soon as we found out, did you see that statue we made of you? Did you see that brass? I mean, that is shiny, isn't it? Don't hurt us. We just didn't know you existed," right? It was their out. Hello? And Paul knows all this. And so what does he do? Notice at verse 24. He says in verse 23, "What therefore you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you," this unknown God, "the God who made the world and all things in it, since he is the Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, neither is he served by human hands as though he needed anything. Since he himself gives to all life and breath and all things, and he made from one," referring of course to Noah, "every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having proclaimed their appointed times the boundaries of their habitation." Correct? What does he do? Notice that Paul does not preach to these Greeks, these evolutionists, and preach Christ first. What does he do? He preaches the Father. He preaches the Creator, Father, God. Correct? And then, notice what he says in verse 30. "Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance." Did Paul call the Greeks stupid? No. He said, you were ignorant, correct? Now listen, gentlemen, don't confuse the word. Ignorance is not a dirty word, and ignorance is not a bad word. All of us are ignorant, is that correct? The word ignorance means without knowledge. And there's lots of things I don't know, and there's lots of things you don't know, correct? We are all ignorant. It's not a dirty word. It's not a bad word. It's just an accurate description, correct? And he doesn't tell the evolutionists that they're stupid. He simply says, you're ignorant. There are things you just don't know. And notice that he says this about God. Therefore, having overlooked the times of your ignorance, God is now declaring to men and women that all everywhere should repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men and all women by raising him from the dead. He preaches the Father, the Creator, first, and then he introduces them to Christ, correct? This is creation evangelism. And when you do creation evangelism, the Bible tells us there are 3 results. Notice, starting at verse 32. Now when they heard the resurrection of the dead, some began to sneer. But others said, we shall hear you again concerning this. And so Paul went out of their midst. Verse 34. But some men and some women believed and joined that very day, correct? So the preaching of creation evangelism is just an alternative to sharing your faith, appropriate in certain conditions and places, and it has 3 results. There are those who will always say, don't confuse me with facts, my mind's made up. They condemn themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, think with me for a moment. If you are not willing to learn, you will never be willing to change. Correct? I mean, I was never this militant atheist like Richard Dawkins. I was never shaking my hand in God's face. To me, God was kind of irrelevant, because if evolution was true, there simply wasn't a God, and I was never a militant atheist. However, certainly you could have called me or described me an atheist or an agnostic, perhaps, but I was never that militant, right? But at the age of 27, in a search for truth, I became a Christian. A year and a half later, I became a creationist. I became a Christian first in a search for truth, when I found out that truth is not a concept. I became a Christian when I found out truth is a person. If you don't believe me, look at John chapter 14, verse 6. Jesus said, I am the truth, and truth is a person and not a concept, correct? And when I figured that one out, I became a Christian, but that just made me a saved evolutionist. Hello? Yeah. I came to Christ through the intellect. You know, everybody comes to Christ in a spectrum. The spectrum comes from entirely intelligent to entirely emotional. But nobody comes 100% one or the other. It's always a mixture of the two. How many of you know of people who have run down an aisle with tears in their eyes to get saved that was 98% emotional, but it's still 2% intellectual? Because they had to make a decision to run down the aisle, correct? And I represent the other end of the spectrum. I came to Christ 98% intellectually and 2% emotionally. The good news is I got a lot more emotional about it after that. But it took me 6 months of study to determine that Jesus was telling the truth. I went through a self-guided study, nothing new, similar to C.S. Lewis or others. It was not new. It had been around for 2,000 years, but I decided to do the same thing. But I came through a scholastic, analytic, search without any other human being guiding me in the process, and came to the realization Jesus was telling the truth. As a seeker of truth, I had to accept it. If you find truth and you're a truth seeker, you have to accept it whether you like it or not, correct? And so I became a Christian in a very matter-of-fact way. I knew so little about Christianity that I actually made an appointment with an associate pastor of a large church near where we lived, made an appointment. He was kind enough to see me. And I simply told him the long version of that story and then asked him, is there something else I need to do? I'm a scientist. When we finish a book, we expect a checklist at the back of the book, correct? And there isn't one. So I asked him the question, is there anything else that I need to do? And he looked at me and he said, so your decision is firm. And I looked back at him and I said, if you knew me, you wouldn't ask the question. He didn't know me. And he said, okay. Kind of took him back a little bit. And he said, opening the Bible, you need to make it public. It's there, fine. You need to be baptized. I said, fine. So, of course, I did that very quickly thereafter, but that just made me a saved evolutionist. Now, Ed mentioned, I'm a lifetime member of Mensa and a lifetime member of Intertel. I was smart enough to know I got a problem. How do you believe in evolution and have a personal relationship with the creator of the universe? Hello? So I spent 16 months, again, with a blank piece of paper, not allowing what I had learned and taught others to influence me. But I started with a blank piece of paper asking the question, did God use evolution to create what we see today? Was what I had learned and taught others okay? Or was it wrong? That God had really spoken it into existence 6,000 years ago, whole, complete, perfect. Human sin had caused the degeneration of it. And after 16 months of study, including many, many things, of course, but I was reevaluating law, natural process, and physical evidence. But at the end of 16 months, I became a biblical scientific creationist one night, when I simply asked myself the question, could the law of gravity ever evolve? Now, I have been studying science for over 60 years. I can think of absolutely no way whatsoever gravity could ever be anything less than it is. It is the universal force in nature. Works everywhere exactly the same way, correct? If you think about it for just a moment, folks, gravity is the force in nature that allows us to understand how God the Holy Spirit can be omnipresent. There is nowhere in the universe where gravity does not exist, correct? Therefore, it is the natural example in nature to show us the supernatural truth of how God the Holy Spirit can be omnipresent. Right? Oh. And so, that night, literally, that was the last straw. And I became a biblical scientific creationist. And the next day, I went out and started teaching about it. And I've been teaching about it ever since. And so today, I'm a full-time creation evangelist. Now, that's kind of the end of the presentation. I understand you're kind of set up to ask questions. That's okay with me. I don't know that we really need mics to do that, but I'd much rather have questions written down, but we didn't have time to get that together either. But any questions about what I've said tonight or anything else? Because if not, I'll just go back to the book table and help you back there. By the way, at the book table, I'll also answer questions too, but yes, sir.
Your evangelism experience in different countries,
Mm-hmm.
attitudes, or whatever.
Well, every culture, of course, is different, and every language is unique. And there's a big problem with that. And this is one of the things that if you're going to do missionary work, you have to come to understand. Because, for instance, how could you talk about this issue in Russia? In Russia, they do not have two different words for kill and murder. In Russia, it's the same word. So how do you talk about the difference between righteous war and killing without sin versus murder, which is killing with sin, when they don't have two different words? You have to really talk about the concepts, don't you? You have to work your way around the issues. And so you have to understand that languages are important because the best of translations isn't good enough. I don't work with translators. I don't. I only work with interpreters. Because I don't work with translators because even the best translator gets mechanical and tends to pick the first easiest word they come to in their brain. I mean, when you think what translators do in their mind in a matter of seconds, it's incredible. You know, in a matter of literally a second and a half, you expect them to translate a sentence properly. You know, that's a gift, frankly. I marvel at it. But an interpreter, which is what I work with, is an interpretation by concept. So I don't worry about a translation by word. It's an interpretation by concept that I'm wanting. It's a much higher level. So that when I work with my interpreters, what happens? They know that in the construction that I have just given in English, that this key word is not the first nuance, it's the sixth nuance of the word in that language that I want. Because it's an interpretation by concept, not merely a good translation. Right? So you have a lot of things that are involved there. And I will tell you that anybody who is willing to learn, and therefore willing to change, will listen. And what's really intriguing to me about it is, you've heard that expression, there's a certain ring to truth. Now, in, for instance, Russian, which is the country I go to the most often, In Russian, it takes 20% more syllables to get the exact same idea across. And it takes longer to get a Russian to understand the concept, but I can tell you this, once they get it, they got it, and they can run with it. So it takes longer, it takes more effort. English is an incredible language when it comes to technology and efficiency. The English language is tremendously efficient and a very good technological language. And therefore, the Russians will never catch up with us technologically. Never. I can promise you that. However, Russian is a much better literary language than English. We think we have great authors in English, and especially as Christians, we would think of all kinds of great, we think of Shakespeare, of course, but we would think of other great, Bunyan and Milton and so forth, and we think we have great literature. The truth of the matter is we don't hold a candle to Russian literature. There are authors in Russian language that cannot even be translated into English because our language doesn't even allow it. They have tenses, cases, and genders. They have 132 different endings to words. Their shade of meaning can be shaved down to a thin deli slice. Are you with me? So that a Russian can understand exactly emotionally what you're telling them to within 132nd of the correct meaning. Hello? So you have to learn things like that. But I can assure you, there is a ring to truth. And when people are willing to learn and they hear truth, I don't care what language, I don't care what country it is, they'll say, wait a minute. And they'll get the concept and they'll run with it. Any other? Yes, sir. I think it is on, but yeah.
Yeah, my name is Sheldon from the Colorado Springs contingent. During your travels, the majority of the clergy or the pastors who believe in an old earth, is it because of what they learned in seminary or to the so-called science or pseudoscience, if you will?
You're asking the question of, is that why they believe it?
No.
Okay.
The most of them, why do they believe in an old earth? Is it because
That's
of
what I'm
science?
saying. You're asking about why. Unfortunately, I will take you back. First of all, we've got to go back 225 years. At the end of the 1700s, the beginning of the 1800s, the church fathers at that time made a bad compromise. Evolutionists were becoming very, very strong by the end of the 1700s. Darwin was not the first evolutionist. He was a Johnny-come-lately at best. And evolution had become very strong by the end of the 1700s, primarily because of, there's 6 French atheists and a couple of others that were influenced the period. But basically, the evolutionists went to the church fathers and said, creation is religion and evolution is science, that we are proving in science that evolution is true. Therefore, you take care of religion and we'll take care of science. That was a bad compromise. And we've been trying to regain the ground ever since. Now, also you have to understand that, again, the gap theory begins in 1813. Other various ways of trying to compromise evolution to deep time into the Bible from other authors. But starting with Chalmers in 1813, Pember in the late 1800s, and then picked up specifically by Dake and Schofield. Schofield's Bible was the one that was used to evangelize the world after World War I. And he picked up the gap theory, but he didn't invent it. He just picked it up. And of course, Schofield later would come up with his as well. And so what happened was these Christian authors who were trying to compromise evolutionary science and put time in the Bible that's not there is where this compromise all comes from. So you have to kind of look at the history of how that worked in. Now, there have always been evolutionists since the Garden of Eden. There have always been people who believed in deep time, okay? If you take a look at some of the ancient writings, now I've got a DVD out there on what is really in the ground versus what's in the textbooks. And I start with showing a listing of ancient evolutionists, and you have to understand that some of them, and some of the philosophers that you would even know from just a common school education, for instance, would say, well, I love this one. Aristotle said There was 200 million years between the flood of the earth and his time. Now think about that for a second. He recognized a worldwide flood, but believed in 200 million years. St. Augustine of Hippo was writing about the Egyptians believing that they could trace astronomical records back for 100,000 years. So there have been people who have believed in deep time and pagan gods and all evolution, so all the way back to the Garden of Eden. If you don't believe me, think about it. We were just reading from Romans 1 and Acts 17, correct? Now, starting with 2,600 years ago, with the Greek philosopher Anaximander, followed by various others, Democritus, Epicurus, we mentioned, and so on. They were teaching evolution for 600 years before Christ was born. And in 3 books in the New Testament, Romans 1, Acts 17, 2 Peter chapter 3, the apostles were talking about the science of creation versus evolution, right? But go back with me 3,000 years. When you go back to the book of Judges, now the book of Judges is written 3,000 to 3,400 years ago, right? Now that's the time between Joshua and King Saul, King David. And we have the period of the Judges. In chapter 17, chapter 21, it says this: when they had no one to rule over them, each man, each woman did what was right in their own eyes or sight, correct? That's an evolutionary philosophical position, that there is no God, there's no lawgiver, therefore we each make our own law. That's a total evolutionary construct. But if you go all the way back to the Garden of Eden, what was the first deception of Satan? He said, "Hath God said?" Oh no, he didn't really say that. He didn't really mean that. You can't trust him. He just knows that if you knew what he knew, then you'd be just like him, and he's just holding out on you. So the philosophical aspect of evolution goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. So there's nothing new about this at all. So there have always been those who were always looking for a way to compromise here or do this. So if I may interject, and I know this is not exactly what you're asking, but if I may interject, you do not want to ask the question, why do evolutionists believe in evolution? Because they do it for many reasons. It's a religion, they can do it for many reasons. They're convinced by this or that or persuaded by so-and-so, right? The real question is, why do they want to believe it? That is the much greater question, okay? And they want to believe in evolution because they want to sin. We're all born with the Adamic nature. We all want to sin, period, right? And so evolution is the only religion that allows them to mentally justify that they can lead a sinless life without Jesus Christ. So they believe in evolution because they want to sin, because they believe that when they die they cease to exist, that there are no consequences, they don't answer to a greater authority, that they can do whatever they want and, quote unquote, lead a sinless life without Christ. Now the Bible would call that manifest delusion, right? But this compromise has been going on all the time. It's nothing new. It didn't just start, 2 decades ago or something like that. Mm-hmm. You? Bill? Of course. I know Mr. Ed. A horse, of course.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm not sure I have this question well phrased, so bear with me, will you?
Maybe I can help you phrase it.
I'm puzzled about the outcome of the speech that he made regarding the resurrection. There were 3 responses you mentioned. Some actually believed and followed him.
Yes, that's right.
Some mocked him and went away.
Yeah.
And
the middle group said, you've got substance. You got something. We need to learn more. And they would learn more. Not all of them would believe, but they would learn more. Some would reject, and some would believe later. So the 3 responses was, first, sneer, mock, don't confuse me with facts, my mind's made up, they condemn themselves. 1/3 said, you've got substance. Right. You've got an argument here, we need to learn more about it, and they would learn more. Even after learning more, some would not believe, but some would. Yeah, but some believe that very day.
Those are probably the people that just enjoy the argument and don't ever make up their mind.
Well, no, I think that it's half and half, that there were those who did learn more and did believe later,
Well, here's
though they're
my
not
pro-
recorded.
Here's my problem. If I had been one of those Epicureans,
Oh, dear.
my reaction would be, resurrection? Are you telling me that this man was resurrected? Not even our high priest is capable of doing that.
But there were Greek philosophies that did believe in resurrection. Mithra, the cult of Mithra, believed in resurrection. So the concept of resurrection was not foreign to the Greeks. There were certain Greek philosophies that did teach resurrection, Mithra being one of them.
But in this pagan culture we're trying to reach, shouldn't we expect to hear that question?
Oh, sure.
And how should we answer?
Well, let me address that a little bit. I mentioned that I became a Christian in a search for truth and did a very scholastic, analytic search for truth. Jesus was telling the truth. Because he's either God or he's not, right? Again, not a new argument. To me, in studying things, now, there are at least a minimum of 6 to 8 historians who talk about Jesus outside the Bible.
About what?
Talk about Jesus existing outside of the Bible.
Okay.
And these are reliable. As a matter of fact, I give a list of them in my book on the feasts. There are many, historical aspects to Jesus in the Bible and outside of the Bible. But the thing that finally got to me after 6 months, and again, I was reading the Bible for the first time, came to understand that actually, if you look at it, the 4 Gospels are legal depositions. But I looked at all this history, both in the Bible and outside of the Bible. And the thing that actually tipped the lever over for me after 6 months, there are, we know, over 500 specific people who would die without recanting that they had seen him after the resurrection. Now, no human being will die to support a lie intentionally. No human being will give up their life intentionally to support a lie voluntarily. Now, there are people who have involuntarily died to support a lie. If I can elaborate, I think if we're honest, there were good Christian German soldiers who died in World War II fighting for Hitler, but they didn't do it voluntarily to support a lie. They did it because if they didn't, their families would suffer, correct? I mean, there was coercion involved here, correct? But there were good German Christian men who died supporting Nazism, even though they knew it wasn't true. So no one will die voluntarily to support the lie of another. So if there's over 500 people that were willing to die and would not recant, that to me gave so much substance to the resurrection that I didn't need anything else.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Yes, ma'am. I see a hand. You don't have to for my part, but that's nice of you for their part. I think we do this, it'll help.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome.
You had mentioned and covered in the Bible what we had just read about people exchange the truth for a lie, and then they give up the glory of God for the worship of animals and, I guess this is a two-part question, the worship of animals and nature, tree huggers, whatever.
Environment, whatever. Mm-hmm.
And it brings to light the evolutionists who believe in climate change.
Which is a joke.
Yes.
It's a joke.
I think you gave a talk
It's a
on
bad
it
joke.
one time on climate change. Something interesting, I have a neighbor who goes to a church about 2 miles from us in Lakewood, and we call it the Spider Church. I don't know if you folks have heard of it. It's architecturally shaped like a kind of a spider, a round building kind of with
yes,
porticles
leg-like
around
structures.
And I think now I just noticed it has turned into the Mile High Church, but our next door
Which
neighbor...
is, of course, what they're on at the time.
Oh, maybe.
You know,
With the legislation.
Just a thought.
But anyway, he's very difficult to reach. We would love to evangelize. He knows where we stand and what we believe in. Maybe, maybe not totally. But he has a strange philosophy where they almost, I don't know if it's a new type of religion. They're not really worshiping nature. And he gave us a video to look at, and we went, oh my God, this is what they're all about. And it was so close to our Christian church. The hymns, raising their hands, and it seemed like they worship a force, almost like a force of the universe. And in that same chapter, it talked about where any kind of Eastern religion has to, you have to appease the god.
Well,
And-
I said that a little earlier.
yeah. He has this idea that you can't talk about anything like bad going on in the world because it creates bad vibes.
Negative energy.
Oh, yeah, negative energy, that's it. How do you evangelize to a person like that? And I'll sit down.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to address both of those things. First of all, I have 40 pages in my book on creation out there refuting any concept of humans having anything to do with global warming, global cooling, or climate change. If you're a Bible-believing Christian, there's about 36 verses the Bible says God's in charge of the weather. We can't change it. Secondly, I go through the entire history of the fact that the earth has been warmer and colder in the past, and it'll be warmer and colder in the future. Right now on my phone, which is in my jacket, there's a website I check every single morning. It's called spaceweather.com. It shows a picture of the sun taken that day and the sunspots. You will notice that sunspots are going down very fast at the moment. We have been cooling for 19 going on 20 years. Sunspot activity is going to what's called a solar minimum. And the two major factors are what are called forcing agents in science for climate weather change long term, not day to day, but long term, are sunspot activities and volcanoes. Volcanic activity always, and I put that in capitals, always cools the earth. Any volcanic activity always cools the earth. In 91, Pinatubo in the Philippines erupted, and 1 year later it had dropped the atmospheric temperature of the earth 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit in 1 year. I'm sorry, 1.3 degrees. Because the dust blocks out sunlight, bouncing heat, light back into outer space. And if you take a look at, for instance, the eruption of Tambora in 1815. In 1816, you have the year without summer. It snowed in all 12 months of the year in Europe in 1816. Because I go to Russia, there was a volcano that erupted in Peru in the year 1600 when it was just the conquistadors and the Indians. It caused a crop failure in Siberia in 1601. They didn't know it was because of a volcano in Peru a year earlier. So in the spring of 1602, they planted their crops because every farmer knows some years you just don't get a good crop. In 1602, that volcano caused such a crop failure in Siberia that 1 million people died in Siberia. 1/3 of the population of Moscow, or 100,000 people, died from starvation in 1602. Volcanoes always cool the earth. But sunspot activity causes the Earth's temperature to warm or cool slightly over long-term periods of time. But right now we're going into a cooler period with the sunspots going to a solar minimum. Okay? So we can't control it. We can't heat it or cool it. Nothing we could do can have any influence whatsoever. But I got 40 pages in my book if you're interested. Okay? Now, in terms of reaching this guy, first of all, what you're really talking about is a Christian variant of the New Age movement. Okay? So when you're trying to evangelize somebody, it doesn't always work. Okay? Remember that you may not be the person who can reach them, but somebody else could. And so you do want to work with them, but don't make them your lifetime project. Okay? There's a lot of wisdom in what I'm saying. So the first question you have to find out is, are they willing to learn? Because if they're not willing to learn, you might as well give up now and go help somebody else that is willing to learn. Okay, so that's the very first thing. Second, if they claim that they are willing to learn, the second question you have to ask them is, what evidence would you accept? You see, there's no sense in me talking to somebody about dinosaurs and people lived together for 2 hours if that doesn't flick their bick, right? Maybe what they really want to know is that we are not 99% the same genetically as chimpanzees, we're only 70%. Or maybe it's the geochronometers, but you have to find out what evidence would you accept. Now listen to me carefully, because this is going to save you a lot of grief, okay? Are they willing to learn? If they're not, forget it. If they say they're willing to learn, what evidence would you accept? If they say, well, if you could show me A, B, C, I would be willing to believe. And you say to them, now listen carefully, well, I don't know that answer, but I know somebody who does. Tell you what, 2 weeks from today, let's meet for coffee and I'll have that answer for you. And I don't care whether you go to Ed or Bill or whoever, or you come to me or whatever, but you get that answer, right? 2 weeks later, you meet them for coffee and you say, okay, now you asked if I could show you A, B, and C. Now here it is, okay? Now are you willing to believe? If they say yes, you lead them to Christ right then, correct? If they say no, now, listen to me carefully now. Right back here, you think, were you lying to me? Out of here, you say, well, I thought you said if I could show you A, B, C, then you'd be willing to believe. Did I misunderstand what you said? And they say, well, yeah, what I really meant was X, Y, Z. And he said, oh, then it was just a misunderstanding. Give them the benefit of the doubt, right? Well, I'll tell you what, I don't know the answer to that, but I do know somebody that does. So 2 weeks from tomorrow, let's meet again for coffee, and I'll have that answer for you. So you go to one of us or whatever, and you find X, Y, Z, right? And you have coffee with them, and you say, here's X, Y, Z. Now are you willing to believe? And if they say no, back here, you think, were you lying to me? Here you say, well, again, maybe I misunderstood you. I thought you said if I showed you X, Y, Z. And they say, well, no. It's really MNN, you know. And you say to them, okay, tell you what, I don't know that one, but I will find the answer for you and get it for you. Let's meet 2 weeks from tomorrow, right? You do that 3 times. Did you hear? You do it 3 times. At the end of the 3rd time, if they're not willing to believe and they still say no, then you know they were lying to you. You have proved it experimentally. Correct? So your hypothesis is now a foregone conclusion. And you say to them, okay, have a nice life. Either they're never going to accept, or you're not the one God is calling to be used to reach them. And after 3 tries, give up and go help somebody else. Are you listening?
I don't think I ever give up.
On them. I'm telling you right now, I'm trying to save you a lot of grief. Because God will lead you to other people you can reach, and you keep trying to reach one that will never change and miss the opportunity to lead 12 to Christ. Who's the worse off? Okay? So be a wise steward of what God has given you to do. Right? Okay. Listen, any other questions? I'll be happy to talk at the table all night if you want. I'm here till tomorrow morning when I leave and go back to Florida, where I think it's cooler than in here right now. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Let's give Dr. McMurtry a cheers. The book table is right in the back. It's not downstairs, so you can go check it out. It's mostly DVDs and some CDs and a couple of books. But don't forget next month, meeting here, Fred Williams, one of our board members, will be speaking to us, and we'll have you come and enjoy that presentation as well. Thank you all for coming out here, and we appreciate that, and you must enjoy a most blessed and Merry Christmas. Okay? God bless you. Bye-bye.